Great to have you join us again. Right about now is Business Review, where we talk about certain business issues and economic activities from around the world. But today we will be staying in Nigeria, and our discussion for today is business of exports. We're going to be reviewing the opportunities and challenges in Nigeria. And joining us to have this conversation today is Dr. Bamidele Ayemibo, PhD, international trade business and development experts, and he's joining me remotely to have this conversation. But before we bring him in, let's take a look at let's create a background of our discussion today. Now, Nigeria is one of the export countries in the world, holding the, say, 51st position. Nigeria's status on the Ease of Doing Business Index has started to show signs of improvement. Now, it is no longer news that the nation's potential has remained largely untapped, as the country's previous growth was fueled by consumption and high oil prices. Because, of course, Nigeria is heavily dependent on oil, which accounts for about 90% of export earnings and over 70% of total government revenues. Now, let's take a look at the largest exported products in Nigeria in 2023. And now this graphics representation shows us that the largest export, let's take a look at the graphics representation of that. The largest exported product in the fourth quarter of 2023 was petroleum oils and oils obtained from bituminous minerals, crude, valued at 10.31 trillion naira, representing 81.23%, followed by natural gas with 1.02 trillion naira, accounting for 8.0%. And we also have urea, whether or not in aqueous solution, with 251.90 billion naira, or 1.98% of total exports. Now, in the fourth quarter of 2023, we have the MBS show data that Nigeria's total trade stood at 26.8 trillion naira from 18.80 trillion naira in the third quarter of 2023, with imports increasing over export in the fourth quarter, with exports totaling 12.69 trillion naira and imports at 14.11 trillion naira. And there you have it. We have more exports, over imports in Nigeria. And as we know, Nigeria is seen as import-dependent economy. So these are some of the issues we'll be trashing as we have Dr. Bamidele join us. Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us on the program this morning.
How are you today?
Very well, thank you. It's good to see you. Okay, like you see me read some of the data, and we have, of course, we know Nigeria as imports-dependent economy, and import is far outweighing exports, and so there's so much to be said about that. But before we go into all of that, let's talk about the business of exports. A lot of people are interested. They have one or two things to do in that, but they do not have that information. Now, aside having my business registration done, what are the steps to take to becoming an exporter?
Okay, first of all, of course, like you said, you have to be a registered business, but it has to be a limited liability. It has to be a limited liability. It can be a cooperative. Of course, it can be a PLC, but not a business registration status. It has to be a limited liability at the minimum. And export must be one of the objectives. So if it's a limited liability, that means exports must be one of the memorandum and article of association of in your registration with Corporate Affairs Commission. And then you need an export license. Of course, you get your export license, export certificate from Nigeria Promotion Council. That's very easy to get. You go to their website, fill in the form, submit and pay with your card, and you can get that done within 24 to 48 hours. Now, these are just getting ready. Now, but more important is to be able to understand export readiness. When we talk about challenges, there's a huge opportunity in export, no doubt. But the challenges is not allowing people to be able to take advantage of that because of the challenge of export readiness. Maybe the call conversation I was talking about this. Let me just define that. Is a multifaceted concept. I'm talking about export readiness. A multifaceted concept that involves the ability of a business to successfully enter the export market, sustainably compete in the export market, and significantly grow its market share until it becomes established in that market. So what has happened is we've seen businesses come in and go out because of some of the challenges you mentioned. As at 2022, according to Nigeria's Promotion Council former executive director, he said Nigeria exporter was 1,172. We are still waiting for the data of last year in terms of the number of exporters, but I'm sure it's not still up to maybe 1,200. And the reason is simple, is still the challenge of export readiness. Now, unfortunately, we operate in a challenging business environment that readiness for export will have helped you to easily overcome. So, in a country like maybe America, UK, US, China, countries that are doing a lot to support exporter, even if you are not fully export ready, to a very large extent, you can still start and probably thrive because there are systems to support you. But in Nigeria, not being export ready can be a disaster, and that's why we have a very high level of mortality rate. Number of registered exporters, according to NEPC, is over 15,000, but less than 1,200 are exporting because of some of these challenges, which we will talk about in the course of the show.
Okay, now we understand. Like, what? Thank you so much for that insightful words coming from you concerning how to start the business of exports. Now, earning in foreign currency is, of course, the essence of exports. Now, what are the opportunities, other opportunities in Nigeria? Because we understand Nigeria, we earn so much big from oil and gas, and that's our biggest earner. Someone who's going into the business of export, what are the opportunities? Are there opportunities, more opportunities for someone entering into that space? Tell us, please.
Yes, particularly in the non-oil export. For the oil export, I mean, that's pretty much controlled by the government. So anybody coming in will most likely have to focus on non-oil export, which we need to grow, by the way. From the data you show, over 80% forex coming in from non-oil export. And that's where when there is a volatility in the market or the price is dropping, it affects us because then it affects our foreign reserve. We're not able to get enough inflow, and that affects the value of the naira. But all in all, there's a huge opportunity in export. Nigeria last year exported over 200 different products beside crude oil and gas. Now, the export market total volume in merchandise is about $24.5 trillion. And this is interesting because when you look at it, 24.5 trillion, it's just not Nigeria that is not taking advantage of it. The contribution of Africa to that 24.5 trillion is 2.5%, sometimes less. EU contribution to that is about 30%. Intra-African trade is 14, 15, some will say 16%. Intra-EU trade is almost 70%. So the reason why EU, America, Asia are taking advantage and are able to really benefit from export in general is because there's so much trade in between them. Even though Africa is over a billion people, 1.3 billion people, and EU is just about 500 or even less than 500 people because of Brexit, they are still doing a lot more in export. So the opportunity in export is very huge, from cocoa to cashew to manufactured goods to solid minerals to agri-commodities to semi-processed. As a matter of fact, semi-processed product is the way to go, because when you look at raw materials contribution to total trade, it's just about 20-25%. Finished goods is about 20-25%. Intermediate product trade is actually about 50-60%. Intermediate means cocoa is raw materials, cocoa butter is intermediate product, chocolate is finished product, lead is raw materials, lead ingot is intermediate product, battery is finished product. So those finished product and raw material are just about 20-25%, but the intermediate product, and the reason is because in the countries that need them don't want the raw material processed in their country because of the waste, because they're trying to protect the environment. So now they want countries, other countries who can afford it to process from raw material into intermediate, and then of course from intermediate into finished goods in their own country. So the opportunity in international trade, particularly in export for Africa, is very, very huge right now.
Oh, interesting. Thank you so much for that. And you mentioned a lot of things. You mentioned the value of the naira and all of that. We'll go and the balance of trade and some of the data you gave. But we understand that exporting is selling and earning in a foreign currency. Now, exporting engages, of course, in the foreign currency transactions by selling local goods and services to buyers. Now, if I want to ask the question, how can I export? The question is, stemming from the fact that there are a lot of bottlenecks when it comes to the foreign exchange market. We see what's been going on, the depreciation of the naira. Of course, it's kind of appreciating right now, but we've seen it fall so low. And also having other countries, for example, in China, they actually depreciate, they reduce the value of their currency because they have so much. They're producing a lot and they want to export. But in our case, we do not have so much to export. And yet the value of the currency is kind of low. So how do you marry, this, whole situation? When I want to export, how do I deal with the foreign currency bottlenecks?
No, that's not really a challenge for an exporter. That is a challenge for an importer. It's not a challenge for an exporter. It's a challenge for an importer because for an
But
importer,
my challenge
yes.
as an exporter would be, what are we producing? What do I have, here that I can actually produce, that I can actually export, that would scale through all the hurdles of, of it not being rejected? Because we've seen over time, that has played out. So that's the challenge of an exporter.
Okay, so if we talk about rejection, when I started, I deliberately defined export readiness. It was deliberate. I defined export readiness. So I think the challenge of the government and anybody who is coming to export hearing this conversation on your show should be, I need to be export ready. Those that know what to do will not find themselves in that problem. When you say Nigeria product is rejected, Nigeria product is rejected, go and check. I've been monitoring the data since 2006. That's almost 2 decades. There are businesses that have been exporting since 2006. I'm monitoring the data, and there are businesses that have come out and have dropped off. And the reason some businesses have remained and some have dropped off is just the challenge of readiness. So if you want to export, I was at an event late last year with a director at Nigeria Provincial Council. We're on the same panel at an event in VI, and was talking about a business who exported raw cashew nut to India, and the cashew nut had issues, and they had to working with the embassy to see how they can salvage the situation. That happening is a sign that whoever is exporting, number one, do not understand the quality specification expected of cashew nut, how to ensure that is met, how to ensure the container is preserved, how to preserve the good in transit for shipment to destination. So it's not a challenge of government, it's a challenge of individual. Where government can come in is to support with capacity building to be able to ensure that the business is export ready, and to put in place at the port system and making to ensure that goods that are of low standard do not leave the country. If I move good to the port and it's not allowed to go because the quality is low, what that happen is that next time I will ensure my quality is right before I take it to the port. So I feel the quality issue can be fixed. The real issue is capacity building. International trade is knowledge intensive. Capacity building to be able to ensure that I know what I want to ship, I know what to do to preserve the quality in transit, and in order to ensure that the good get there on time. The exchange rate issue or quality of naira for an exporter, if I want to export, what I need to be sure of is, what is the rate? If the rate is going up, it's good for the exporter. The rate's coming down now, it's not really good for exporter. But an exporter can still export, because what I would do is to ensure before I ship, I want to ensure, okay, at what rate am I shipping? And that's why the rate must be stable. And that's why either it's high or low, stability is very key. Because when it is stable, then it's predictable, then I can plan, then I can work around the rate for me to be able to grow to be able to be profitable. So I don't export. And for example, I did a shipment. This rate came down now. The rate was high when I did the shipment. Now it's low. I mean, that would mean there will be an erosion of the profit of that transaction. But that's fine. If it is stable, then we are fine. Now, countries, like you said, try to undervalue their currency to encourage export. But like you said, we are import dependent. We are doing so much import, and that's why we can't really do that right now. We need to grow non-oil export. Non-oil export in Nigeria is very low. Number of exporters in Nigeria 1,000. In UK is over 100,000. In US almost 300,000. In Africa, even Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, South Africa are doing a lot better in terms of the number of exporters and in terms of export per capita. When you look at the number of exporters vis-a-vis the population, Nigeria is very low, which is why what you are doing must be commended. We need to get a lot of message out there to educate the public, number one, but more importantly, forget the government to do what they need to do. As far as the government is concerned, I feel the president needs to do more in terms of speaking about non-oil export in a way that gets his ministers, Minister of Finance, Minister of Trade, NEPC, to do much more, and of course support them to be able to do what they need to do to grow non-oil export in Nigeria.
Oh, awesome. Now, you made mention that the business of exports has to do a lot with capacity, and it's information driven. In other words, if one is to go into that business, you have to have a lot of information. Of course, you are going to be giving us that information where someone watching today might be interested, in exporting business. We're going to get, how do we get that information? You're going to tell us before we wrap up this discussion. But let's go straight to another question where, of course, we see Nigeria play an important leadership role, in both West Africa and on the African continent. Now, of course, the headquarters of the Economic Community of West African State, ECOWAS, is in Abuja, Nigeria, southwest Nigeria. So how can we really begin to play the big brother role when it comes to exporting? We have seen the case of AfCFTA, that's the African Continental Free Trade Area. The drafting and the implementation is where we are at right now. And with all of that going on, of course, there are a lot of bottlenecks when it comes to AfCFTA. So how can we begin to play that big brother role when it comes to export? Has there been any improvement so far? Are we really the big brother when it comes to exporting in Africa?
We are not. The largest exporter in Africa is South Africa, over 120 billion. In fact, before COVID, South Africa was about 90 billion plus. Nigeria was about 60 billion plus. After COVID, 4 years after COVID, South Africa is already hitting about 120 billion. Nigeria is at about 70 billion. In fact, Algeria has overtaken Nigeria. So Nigeria is no more number 2 in Africa in export. Nigeria is number 3. So we are not doing enough as far as non-oil export in general, not even non-oil export. Export in general is concerned. And the reason is because I don't think the government is really very, very serious on growing non-oil export or growing export in general, non-oil export in particular. And the reason why I say that is this. If you want people to businesses to look at a particular sector of the economy, there are steps you take. For example, a number of countries have incentives for exporters. Nigeria have those incentives in the law, but we don't implement them. The last administration of CBN started a particular program that was seeing growth in non-oil export. They were supporting non-oil export by ensuring that for every dollar you bring in, you get some amount of naira to help you grow the volume of your export. And it made a lot of people not just to repatriate, but more importantly, is to ensure that they grow the volume of export. And we began to see from the data available, we began to see that. But that has stopped now. But the government have not replaced that with other things that will help that to happen. As a matter of fact, Nigeria have signed AfCFTA even though we signed late. Nigeria have ratified AfCFTA even though we ratified also a bit late. Nigeria have not started trading under AfCFTA. Other countries have started trading, from Ghana to Kenya. South Africa have joined. Rwanda and the like have joined, but Nigeria has not, because the president have not approved, as far as I know, because it's not in the news that has approved yet, the process of obtaining certificate of origin a critical document required for export in Africa? If it has been approved, I'm not aware yet because we have not started guided trade initiative. So what I think we need to do to show that brick border you talk about is we must champion the export under in Africa under AFCFTA. And the first thing to do is to ensure we finalize on the process of obtaining certificate of origin in order for Nigeria business community in Nigeria to know. So now if I want to ship to Kenya under AFCFTA, these are the things I must do and this is the way to go about it. The National Action Committee on AFCFTA have engaged with private sector. They've received private sector input both in I think in Lagos. I think it's at Man House in Lagos. So input has been gotten in. We expect that NAC should take it to the presidency. I don't know what is going on there yet, but what I'm seeing is the fact that we are not seeing the president, we are not seeing the presidency, we are not seeing the federal government taking a lot of steps, and I mean very serious, aggressive steps to ensure that we play that big border role in export as yet. I don't know what will happen before the end of the year, but as far as I know right now, we are not doing enough.
Oh, interesting. Now, you know, there are some most valuable export products that amounted to the increase in GDP in Nigeria. And of course, some of the products exported include, like we said earlier, crude oil. It is the highest, petroleum gases. You know, what else can rise to this level? You mentioned that we need to dive into the non-oil sector. Can you mention specifically what else do you think that we have in Nigeria that can actually take us to that level where oil and gas is? You mentioned how South Africa is the highest or the biggest exporter on the continent, and Nigeria has dropped even lower. And so what do we have? What do you think that can match up, you know, with oil and gas in Nigeria?
Now, you know, apart from oil and gas, there are a number of other products with very, very huge demand in the world. So, and this question you ask is very important, and I will tell you why it's important. It's important because this question is going to help us to, first question we should ask is, what are those products with high demand in the world that Nigeria is capable of exporting? What are those products with high demand in the world that Nigeria is capable of exporting? Now, number one is crude oil and gas, which we are already doing. Now, but if you look at the global trade in general, the top item of export in global trade are value-added manufactured goods. Value-added manufactured goods. Let me give you an example. Manufactured goods takes up about 60, value-added manufactured goods take up about 60% of global trade. In fact, fuel, minerals is actually less than 10%. Less than 10%. So we actually are better off adding value and growing. So we have cocoa, we have cashew, but we rather will focus on other commodities like soybeans. Soybeans have a huge demand, and Nigeria is not doing well in the export of that product. Fertilizer have a huge demand. Now, with what Dangote is doing now, and with what Notori Chemical, this company in Port Harcourt, I've forgotten their name, are doing, we need to support the growth of that kind of initiative to be able to grow the non-oil export of Nigeria. In addition to that, we need to support significantly value add. Let me give an example. Cocoa beans, value export, cocoa beans. Total market size is about $10 billion. $10 billion. Guess the value of chocolate export? $30 billion. So the question is, who is making money in export? The Netherlands, who is adding value to chocolate, the German, the UK, the American, who are adding value to it. And interestingly, 75% of export of cocoa in the world is from West Africa. From Cote d'Ivoire to Ghana to Togo to Nigeria, and of course, maybe Central Africa, Cameroon. So adding value. Another example will be cashew nut. If I export a If I export a ton of cashew nut, maybe I will get $1,000, maybe $1,500, or max $2,000. But if I remove the shell and I convert to cashew kernel, I've not even roasted it to roasted cashew nut, and I export it, I'll be selling at about 8,000, 9,000, sometimes $10,000. The people making money from export are the people that are adding value to it. So what I think government need to begin to do is to give incentive to those that are adding value to export. But in terms of what can be expected, and as far as export is concerned, there's so many. I said, like I told you, that NDPC confirmed that Nigeria is exporting over 200 different products, and each of them have huge demand, with many of them in hundreds of billions of dollars in demand.
You know, the bottom line of what you've said and what I take out of what you've said so far is that there has to be government policies that will encourage, you know, value added to certain people who provide these manufactured or valued manufactured goods that can actually be, you know, viable for exports. And so government policy plays a huge role when it comes to this. Now, but we have seen incidences where, you know, some exported products get rejected in the international market, like I did bring to your attention earlier. You know, what has improved so far? And, you know, you mentioned how that we can go into having products like cocoa, things like produce like soya beans, that it can do very well. They're in high demand internationally. But we are still in a situation where we get imports from, you know, America and other countries. We get wheat. These grains are still being imported. Meanwhile, we produce these grains in Nigeria. So what can be done to stem that, to see that, you know, we can actually have our own grains and homegrown good quality grains that will not be rejected, and we can actually export, like soya beans you mentioned, is in high demand. So how can we're not even talking about being sufficient yet, you know, for ourselves. Now we're talking, because you need to be sufficient for you to be able to export. So where are we right now when it comes to that?
Now,
How have we?
first of all, what can the government do? So, top export from Nigeria as of 2022, we have fertilizer, we have cocoa beans, we have gold, we have raw aluminium, we have cashew nut, we have rubber, we have crustacean, that's shrimps, we have raw lead, we have raw aluminium. What can the government do? Support the growth of this product. How? Number one, Nigerian ambassadors need a KPI on export. Ambassadors of other countries in Nigeria, one of their major tasks is to grow export of the product of that country into Nigeria. Nigerian ambassador abroad need a KPI that has to do with growing export. So you're an ambassador to Brazil, you're ambassador to America, you're ambassador to the UK. This is the current export of Nigeria to UK. In another 1 year, you need to grow it to this level, else you lose your job, someone else will come and take over. The ambassador must see themselves as marketing Nigerian products, talking about trade promotion. Number two, subsidies. Subsidy in terms of incentives. Incentive. Different countries, if you see any country growing export, including China, including America, they have been able to support non-net export. Sometimes it's in financing, giving single-digit financing. Nexim is doing that, but Nexim requirements are like the commercial banks, even though they do one single-digit. But they're required like commercial bank. What that means is that it then makes it difficult for other people who have potential but are unable to get it to do that. Number three, export credit insurance. If I export, you know, Ukraine is at war. People are exporting to Ukraine. People are exporting to Israel. People are exporting to countries that have issues. Why? Because the government support their citizens to ship to those countries, and they insure the payment. If I know I'll be insured, I will ship to those countries. And that means that I can, for example, let me give you an example. Out of the four commonly used payment methods in international trade, one of them is called letter of credit, we call B for collection. We have one called open account, cash against document. It involves shipping goods to destination and the buyer paying within 30, 60, or 90 days after shipment. Now that poses a risk, the risk of not getting paid. So what many countries have done is to help their exporter insure that risk. That make the exporter to take on more risk, and do more shipment. That way, because they know they are being insured, even if there are issues, the government can talk to the government in that country and get the issue solved because the government is insuring that risk. That way, people are encouraged to take on more risk and grow the non-export. So we need the government to come in to support in terms of export credit insurance, in terms of single-digit loan and make it easier to access, in terms of export promotion, not just by the NEPC, by the government, in terms of supporting NEPC. NEPC got 50 billion naira after COVID. That's the highest they've gotten since inception in terms of intervention fund to support them. They've not had any, and a lot of businesses got that money. I'm part of the consultant hired to review businesses to get that money, and I'm aware it's not an audio money. There are businesses in Nigeria that got that money without knowing anybody, just applying, and they were able to put it in their business. We need that kind of intervention from time to time for the government to be able to ensure that the growth in this sector really become very serious and very apparent, very real rather than apparent that we see right now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bamidele. This is more like a master class because, you're just giving us these pointers. And, of course, I believe that our viewers are getting to understand the terrain when it comes to being the business of export. Now, before we let you go finally, please, can you tell us, we have seen data show that imports is increasing over exports. And it actually did in the fourth quarter of 2023. And we are in the first quarter, just ended the first quarter of 2024, with exports totaling 12.69 trillion naira. That's talking about the export versus import in 2023 fourth quarter. And we saw import at 14.11 trillion naira. Now, let's talk about balance of trade. How can Nigeria begin to achieve a balance between imports and export? And let's do away with this cliche that Nigeria is import-dependent economy. Can that cliche actually go away? Can we actually balance our trade? Is it possible? And what can be done?
Yes. We must be deliberate about this. Number one, we should encourage import of raw materials and discourage export of finished goods that Nigeria can produce. So, for example, and this will start with the government. I mean, we know there was a buaha against the legislature importing cars when Nigeria is producing cars. Those are ways, because the biggest spender in Nigeria is the government. So if the government take it up on itself and say all government officials should begin to buy Nigeria. I know Ajuri Ngelali talked about this recently when he was talking about the fact that the president wants to be buying Nigeria. So, for me, I call it like parent, like children. If the parents are not doing it well, the children are not going to do it the same. If the parents are using made in Nigerian cars, made in Nigerian shoes, they have the moral right to begin to preach it to other Nigerians to do. But if the parents or the leaders are not doing it, it's going to be challenging. So we want the balance of trade. We want to be able to grow our non-export. Then we must lead by example by buying Nigeria, number one. Number two, encourage local manufacturing. Okay, now we have MPR go up, and I understand what CBN is trying to do on one hand, but we can have a handshake with the fiscal policy to see how can these fiscal policies support manufacturing, knowing now that manufacturers are going to have to take loan at a very expensive rate because the MPR has gone up, the interest rate has gone up, because they need to increase that to bring in foreign currency so that they can issue treasury and another government instrument to be able to ensure more forex coming to Nigeria and be able to increase value of naira, which is good. But we now need handshake with the fiscal side to now begin to support. So increasing electricity tariff is not what we should be doing at this time when we're already increasing interest rate for manufacturers. So we should now begin to see what can we do in terms of subsidizing and supporting manufacturers so that manufacturer can produce at a competitive rate for us to be able to export. So whatever incentive can be given, tax incentive, fund that can be used to support, whatever support, there's so many ways the government can support manufacturer at this point. Number one, let's do away with the increase in tariff. Number two, How can we help them to get more single-digit rate from development finance institution? Number 3, how do we reduce the cost of duty that they are paying on the input they are importing? Reduce the cost of duty that they are paying on the input they are importing. So that at the end of the day, while we are trying to fix the economy, we are not increasing job loss from the government.
Oh, interesting. That's a good way to, end this conversation. And I want to thank you so much. But if there is any parting shots that you have for us when it comes to, like I said, you tell us how, tell our viewers how they can be part of this export, the business of exports, what information they need, where do they go and get this information that would help them, get into this space without hurdles or any problems. So do you have any, parting shot or any advice to that?
Yes, we actually do free seminars every Thursday. We won't do tomorrow because of public holiday. I mean, we won't do today because of public holiday. We'll continue next week Thursday. Every Thursday on Zoom. Every Thursday on Zoom. We have a lot of material on our YouTube channel, Global Trade Tutor. If you visit Global Trade Tutor on our YouTube channel, you'll be able to get a lot of information we post every day. And if you chat us on that Global Trade Tutor, you'll be able to get information on the free webinar on Zoom every week. We also run a capacity building and mentoring program because, like I said earlier, which alluded to also the fact that there is need for capacity building. If you know better, you can do better. So I would recommend you consider joining the free webinar or going on our YouTube channel, Global Trade Tutor, to be able to learn more about export. And of course, you'll be able to have enough information to be able to ensure that at the end of the day, you come in with enough to be able to make the business a success. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bamidele Ayemibo. And Dr. Bamidele is an international trade and business development expert. Thank you so much for this insightful conversation. I mean, I call it a lecture because there's so much, you've talked about. And we are going to be having you some of the time because there's other areas that we're not able to touch. But of course, we're going to streamline that because this whole topic is so broad. And we're going to be bringing, I hope we can have you some other time on the program. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay. All right. That's been a conversation on the business of exports, taking a look at the challenges and the opportunities in the exports business in Nigeria, talking about balance of trade, talking about the most exported goods or services in Nigeria. And of course, we know that Nigeria has to do more, even though we are climbing when it comes to the ease of doing business index. And of course, that's the good news. And so there's so much to be achieved, like the expert did say. But of course, we will be having this conversation some other time, and we'll delve into some other areas we're not able to touch today. And but with that, we want to say thank you so much for joining us on this discussion segment. But of course, the program continues, and we'd like to bring you a report that has to do with electricity tariff hike in Nigeria. That is one conversation that is not going to go away anytime soon because we see reaction continue to trail this particular announcement by the sector, the electricity sector in Nigeria. And so we've had legal practitioners, we've had SAN, like the person of Femi Falana, react to this, saying that he's actually going to sue NEC, for the electricity hike in tariff. And so we also have our correspondent speak with a constitutional lawyer who also gave us his reaction to the matter. And so we're going to bring you that report as we go on this quick break. But when we return, the program continues. So stay with us. We'll be right back.